the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. I think you're the first visitor I've had in 40 years. You mind if I light up?
You may if you wish.
You're after something.
I was asked to question you about your dealings with the Newton boys.
Yeah, I knew him.
Well, more specifically, where they hid the loot that they stole.
You're funny. If I knew where that loot was, I'd be gone right now.
Well, you may not know where it is, but could you at least tell us what you know of the Newton boys?
The Newton boys. Willie, Willis, Jess, and Joe. The Newton Boys' Lost Loot by Wallace O. Cheriton. In terms of people killed and publicity, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were probably the most notorious gangsters the state of Texas has ever produced. But in terms of number of banks robbed, amount of money stolen, diversity of criminal activity, and longevity in the gangster business, Bonnie and Clyde couldn't hold a candle to the famous Newton brothers of Uvalde, Texas. No one knows positively when the criminal careers of Willie, Willis, Jess, and Joe Newton got started. Although the brothers may have been involved in chicken larceny earlier, the first arrest apparently occurred in 1910, when Willis was caught trying to steal something he couldn't eat, couldn't carry, and couldn't sell. A 600-pound bale of cotton. For his trouble, Willis was sentenced to 2 years in the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville, Texas. It may have been the first, but it certainly wasn't the last time one of the Newtons would hear the clang of a closing steel door. By 1914, Willis, the acknowledged family leader, was back on the streets and back in the hold-up business. One of his first big jobs was to hit the bank in Winters, Texas for about $20,000. Despite a successful holdup, there were problems. An accomplice, Al Inman, was killed by a posse that chased the pair. Willis himself was later captured in Bollinger, but he managed to escape from the local jail. Having to trust strangers bothered Willis, and he decided his criminal activity ought to be a family affair. It apparently took little convincing to get Willie, Joe, and Jess to join right in, because shortly after the Winters job, the family swooped down on Hondo, Texas, and hit 2 banks on the same day, escaping with a reported $150,000. They later hit a bank in New Braunfels for a reported $200,000. For diversification, the Newtons later struck at the Dallas post office and made off with $38,000 and an undetermined amount of stamps. Not long afterwards, the brothers held up a mail truck in Denison and Katy trains near Bells and Texarkana. As the heat from the law began to build in Texas, the Newtons moved on to banks, trains, and post offices throughout the Midwest, including several train and bank jobs in Kansas and Oklahoma. It has been since estimated that during their careers on the wrong side of the law, the Newton boys held up at least 60 banks and an untold number of trains, post offices, and assorted other targets. So prolific were the Newtons that by 1924, the effort from assorted law enforcement agencies to capture the gang members was really beginning to build. A total of almost $100,000 in rewards had been posted by Texas authorities, and various members of the family were under federal indictments in Sherman and Winters, Texas, as well as in Kansas and Missouri. As a defense against increased police awareness, the brothers decided they needed an alias. After apparently not much thought, they decided to begin using West rather than Newton. That meant that each of the boys simply kept his real first name and changed his last name, apparently believing that law enforcement officers would never suspect that Willis, Willie, Joe, and Jess West might just actually be Willis, Willie, Joe, and Jess Newton. The boys' choice of an alias may have spoken volumes about the intellectual capabilities of the Newtons. They all had guts, no question about that, But brains? That may have been another story. To the brothers' credit, they did recognize that, despite the fancy new names, the climate in Texas was getting most unhealthy for aspiring bank robbers. In early 1924, the Newtons packed up and headed for East St. Louis to continue their life of crime. It is doubtful the boys ever considered that they had embarked on a course that would take them straight into the record books of criminal activity. Not long after their arrival in East St. Louis, the Newtons met and fell in with a couple of fellow Texans named Samuel Grant and Blackie Wilcox. Grant, a convicted killer, and Wilcox, a small-time bank robber, had recently relocated to St. Louis from the Texas State Prison at Huntsville. The fact is, had either man waited for legal release, he would have still been in prison. But the lure of a life of crime had overpowered the pair, and they in turn overpowered a couple of guards and escaped. Either Grant or Wilcox, we'll never know which, was acquainted with a notorious character in Chicago named Max Greenberg. Apparently Greenberg got word to his Texas friend that he had a contact inside a railroad in Chicago and was putting together a gang to pull a series of perfect robberies. It's a good bet that the Newtons didn't have to hear the story twice. In a matter of days, the 6 Texans headed for Chicago, then the world capital of gangster activity. Greenberg and an accomplice named Walter McComb did have an inside man with the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad who was willing to supply vital information about certain shipments. The newly formed gang quickly formulated a plan for pulling off their perfect train robberies. To test the plan, the gang hit trains in Harvey, Illinois, and Indiana Harbor. Sure enough, the inside information proved totally accurate, and the gang decided it was time for the big score. On Thursday, June 12, 1924, 8 armed men stopped a southbound Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul express and mail train near Roundout, Illinois. Unlike the other 2 holdups, something went wrong. Some people claimed Willie Newton disobeyed direct orders from Greenberg, the gang leader. Others say Greenberg simply panicked. Either way, Greenberg opened fire and Willis was hit 6 times in the jaw, arm, and side. When the other men heard the shooting, they also opened fire and proceeded to shoot up the train. The guards in the express car panicked and refused to open the door until gang members hurled gas bombs inside. Once the express car was opened, gang members armed with their inside information selected the 63 mail sacks they knew contained the most loot. It is doubtful that any of the members of the gang suspected in his wildest dreams that the sacks would yield almost $100,000 in cash and $2 million in negotiable securities. The robbery was destined to be the largest train heist in U.S. history. It was also the last great American train robbery. The gang members loaded their loot and a very shot-up Willis Newton into 4 Model T Ford trucks and chugged off into the night in an attempt to make their getaway. Within an hour, all the law enforcement authorities in Illinois had been placed on alert, and Chief Postal Inspector A.E. Germer had arrived in Roundout to take charge of the investigation and orchestrate an extensive manhunt. He boldly predicted that in a matter of days, the crime would be solved and all the gangsters would be in custody. He was correct with that prediction. 2 days after the robbery, Willis Newton, who was more dead than alive, was delivered to an underworld doctor in Chicago. The doc managed to patch Willis up, but the gangster was so weak from loss of blood that he couldn't be moved. He was captured without incident later that second day. By June 16th, the postal authorities had gathered enough evidence to know who had pulled the heist, and they were watching every road for any sign of the getaway trucks. They got a break when many of the looted mail sacks were discovered near Joliet, Illinois. Authorities managed to follow truck tracks to a hideout and there easily captured 3 gang members who turned out to be the other Newton boys. The postal authorities then expanded their search, and in a matter of days, all the gang members were in custody and most of the loot had been recovered. The story of America's largest train robbery ended when all the participants were convicted and sent to the federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas. Jess, Willie, and a fully recovered Willis Newton all received 12-year sentences, while Joe, the baby of the family, got off with a year and a day. The Chicago debacle and subsequent prison time might have ended the criminal careers of many hoodlums, but not the Newtons. The fact is, for the next 30 or 40 years, one or another of the brothers continued to try his hand at robbery. The stories of the Newton boys' exploits have become almost legendary in Texas. In 1962, Willis went to jail for a year in Oklahoma on kidnapping charges. In 1968, 44 years after the great train robbery, Willie got tired of life in a rest home and decided to go out in style. He was later trapped inside the bank at Rowena, and rather than give up, chose to shoot it out with Sheriff Donald Atkins. It wasn't much of a shootout, and what there was ended when the old man was wrestled to the ground and disarmed. When asked to comment, Sheriff Atkins replied simply, "It's the same old Willie Newton." In 1973, longtime San Antonio columnist Sam Kendricks caught up with Joe Newton for an interview. When asked if the brothers had finally retired, Joe replied, "Sure, don't you reckon it's time?" As to why they retired, Willis may have said it best in a quote printed in a New York newspaper. "The trouble with this world today," Willis retorted, "is that there are just too many darn laws." Because the Newton boys' criminal career spanned more than half a century, they touched the lives of many lawmen, and there are lots of stories about their exploits. Undoubtedly, many of the stories are true, and probably just as many would be classified as folklore. The most famous Newton story may very well be nothing but a tall tale, since everyone who could verify it has been dead for years. But given the wild nature of the brothers, it may also be absolute fact. The story was provided by Charlie Eckhart, a well-known talented Western writer and owner of the Lone Star Barber Shop in downtown Seguin, Texas. According to Charlie, back in the 1950s, his family owned a ranch south of San Antonio, and one of their hands was a cowboy named Tim Newton, who claimed to be a cousin of the famous Newton boys. One night, Charlie and some of the boys, including Tim Newton, were sitting around a campfire swapping true stories. When it came Tim's turn, he told a tale that fascinated and excited the group. In the more than 30 years since Charlie heard the story firsthand, some of the details have gotten fogged. But enough information remains clear so the story can continue to fascinate and excite anyone with an adventuresome mind. As the story goes, in the early 1920s, when the Newton boys started their excursions outside of Texas, they ventured first to Kansas, where a bank and a train became Newton victims. The boys pulled off the robberies without a hitch and headed back to Texas with a sack full of loot that included somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 in gold coins. On their way back to Texas, the boys wanted to go in style, so they brazenly purchased a new Packard touring car and drove it all the way to San Antonio. Once in the Alamo City, the brothers decided to lay low for a while and let the heat cool off. They collectively decided that the best place to accomplish both laying low and partying would be in one of the San Antonio's sporting houses. The boys moved into one of the better houses and embarked on a world-class drinking spree. As Charlie Eckhart pointed out, while some people get mean when they drink and other people get sad when they drink, the Newton boys got worried when they got drunk. On the second or perhaps the third day of their drinking spree, the boys decided that someone might begin to get curious about a bunch of Uvalde boys having so much money, especially with a lot of it in gold. Since all the brothers were by then wanted under various federal indictments, one of them suggested the prudent thing to do would be to bury the loot and come back for it later. It must have sounded like a good idea, because the boys piled into the Packard and headed west on one of the many dirt roads that lead out of San Antonio. When they had driven for a while, the drunk gangsters stopped beside a field covered with a lot of white flat rocks. The boys selected a nice big rock, turned it over, and began to dig. When they had hollowed out a large enough space, they dumped all the gold and assorted other cash into the hole, covered it over with dirt, and replaced the rock. Satisfied that their secret was now protected under the rock, the boys returned to the Packard and headed back to San Antonio for more drinking and carousing. 2 or 3 days later, when the money the boys had kept on hand began to run out, they began to sober up. At first, there was some confusion about what had happened to the rest of the loot, but as the alcoholic fog began to clear, slowly the memories of the little drive into the country returned. No problem, the boys thought. They decided to get back into the Packard, drive west until they found the field with the white rocks, and turn over every one till they found the right one. The plan might have worked except for 2 things. First, when the boys drove to the outskirts of San Antonio, they discovered, to their great displeasure, that there were several roads heading west. The then sober Newtons didn't have a clue as to which road they had taken to bury their loot. The boys just picked a road and headed out of town to see what they could find, but they soon discovered something that Charlie Eckhart may have described best. According to Charlie, in those days, if you had tied a 30-mile-long rope from the flagpole on top of the Alamo and swung it in an arch west of San Antonio, every field that rope would have crossed over would have been covered with large, white, flat rocks. Despite spending the better part of a day searching, the Newtons were unable to find the rock, and that was a double catastrophe. Not only were the boys almost broke, but their supply of ready cash was apparently lost for all time. It became apparent very quickly to the boys that they could either spend a lot of time turning over rocks, or they could find a bank to rob. It wasn't one of those decisions that had to be pondered long, and the Newton brothers were soon back to their wayward ways. Within 2 or 3 years, they had pulled off the Chicago train heist and taken up residence in Leavenworth. According to Cousin Tim, although the boys often talked of the missing loot, they never again even went searching for it. Over the years, many people have heard the story of the Newton boys' lost loot. This particular tale, like so many other tales of buried treasure, may be nothing more than pure fantasy. On the other hand, this tale, like some other buried treasure tales, may have a basis in fact. There have been reports over the years that several people have searched for the treasure. Perhaps someone found it and kept the find a secret. Or perhaps the loot is today resting beneath the concrete foundation of some building or highway. Then there is also the possibility, admittedly a long shot, that even today the Newton boys' lost loot lies waiting under a large, white, flat rock somewhere west of San Antonio. If you have information or stories about the Newton boys, please share them with the author at Wordware Publishing, Inc. If you have solid information about where the buried treasure may be located, the author will be happy to provide shovels, a strong back, and liquid refreshment in return for the opportunity to join in the search and share in the loot. Can you imagine that there could be treasure out there next to the Alamo? I visited the Alamo several times and I've never heard about this. Let's go and look for it sometime, shall we? Until then, thank you so much for listening, and Godspeed.